Hello and welcome to Beyond the Broadcast. My name is Seth Ressler. I am the community building consultant at Paragon, and I am also the founder of Community Marketing Revolution. And this is a series of conversations and virtual events that we have been putting together for public media broadcasters. We wanted to bring in community professionals from outside the industry and talk to them, find out what we could learn and how we can apply it to public broadcasting. And I'm excited for our guest today because he is the former director of community and interactive product at CNN. He has, for more than 25 years, been building community focused and interactive products. Sometimes it's been for household names like CNN and Forbes that you know, and sometimes it's been for small online communities that you've never heard of. But with a blend of community, product, and program management, his career has centered around the creation of safe, inclusive platforms and services that drive action, grow revenue, and increase retention. I want to welcome Patrick O'Keefe. Hi, Patrick. How are you?
Hey Seth, thanks for having me. I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, good. I'm excited to have you here for this conversation because, we've been talking to a lot of community professionals in this series. But frankly, a lot of them come from places like customer success or customer support. That's where a lot of brands build their communities. It's great to talk to somebody who comes from building communities for media outlets and, frankly, for media outlets that do journalism, because I think we're going to get into a little bit about, what that actually looks like. So I'm excited that you're here today. Let's talk a little bit about the topic. This is 5 lessons from building community for CNN. And can you explain exactly what the community concept was at CNN? What were you doing there? What was it all about?
Sure, sure. And it's funny to hear you introduce me as someone coming from the news and journalistic side, because for years and years, I applied to a few different jobs in media and at media orgs. And, I could never get any headway 10, 15, 20 years ago because I didn't have a journalism degree. Even though I had experience in community moderation, trust, safety, and policy, I just couldn't get past that. And I was told that. And that's just how sort of things shift over time, or the industry shifts over time, because the role at CNN was created for me. And I came into it and had a lot of fun, and it was a great opportunity. But yeah, it's just a funny thing to hear that. I would say at CNN, to answer your question directly, I was initially brought into an ideation team to sort of come up with community concepts, interactive ideas that CNN could then take and build a subscription business around, theoretically, like a monthly subscriber business. And they took different forms. One of them was sort of a local video product that allowed you to stitch together local video broadcasts theoretically and have it be curated. And there were a couple other ones, and kind of CNN killed them all. And they didn't get past sort of that ideation stage. And then we had one that made it past the ideation stage, which was Interview Club, which became part of CNN Plus, which we'll talk a little bit about. But I was just put together with some great, we had a great team of people, really talented, smart people, just coming up with ideas that CNN could build, and then sort of grow their revenue on top of sort of the linear revenue, right? The cable satellite subscription revenue, and they get from TV. What could they do in addition to that wouldn't disrupt that revenue? So we were kind of focused on things that brought people together.
Good. You mentioned CNN Plus. Can you talk a little bit about where the idea of community came from, and was it, hey, we've got the CNN Plus thing and we got to do a community aspect to it, so let's do that? Or was community sort of this other idea that had been floating out here, and then they got to the point where they're like, oh, we've got this CNN Plus thing, maybe we folded into that? What did that look like?
Yeah, I mean, CNN has had a lot of interesting community and interactive ideas over, their long digital history. A lot of smart community builders either at CNN or have worked at CNN, working on different concepts and ideas. So I think it's something they're always sort of noodling with. With me specifically, the idea that came out of that program, Interview Club, was an interactive live Q&A platform where a community of smart question askers could submit questions, vote on them, and then those questions would be asked by a CNN personality to a newsmaker, celebrity, etc. It's not like a revolutionary concept. I was at Yahoo Chats with bands in the mid-90s. So to me, it's, this is just kind of an iterative idea on something that's existed since the dawn of the internet, more or less, or the interactive internet. And so we were building that out as sort of a standalone product. And as as that was happening, the word from on high came through and was like, well, we're building a streaming service, CNN Plus, and we'd like community and interactive products to be one of the three core pillars that bring people to the service. The first being exclusive live programming only on CNN Plus. The second being CNN's incredible archive of content that they have from their 30, 40 years of producing news and interactive and smart content. And then the third being an interactive feature set. And the first one of those was Interview Club. So you had to be a CNN Plus subscriber to submit questions and vote in them and to watch the broadcasts. And so, yeah, it sort of was an idea that was sort of plucked and said, we want it to be one of the core benefits. You're kind of working on this now. And so we shifted our efforts from a standalone product to being part of a new streaming service.
Got it. And talk to me a little bit about some of the things that you had done before your time at CNN. And were there things that were difficult to bring to either a media organization or a news organization, or had to be adapted in any way? Like, did you have to change your thinking, or is community building the same regardless of the type of organization that you're at?
So quick intro of what I was doing before. So I started moderating communities for other people in 1998, just kind of small independent online communities. I started launching my own in 2000. I registered my first domain name on January 1st, 2000, Y2K for those who were there. And I started launching kind of independent online communities that I hosted. I did that for about a decade before releasing a book called Managing Online Forums that it took me 5 years to write and find a publisher for. And then once that book came out and was in a lot of bookstores nationwide, it gave me the opportunity to sort of open some doors to companies that were either using concepts from the book directly or that I could help use those concepts, companies like FedEx and Sony and Cisco Systems. And then, flash forward another 10 years, I was independent doing things for myself and for others. And then I joined a small organization that builds membership programs for media brands like Forbes, kind of paid professional membership communities. Did that for a couple of years before being recruited to CNN. As far as like changing my thinking, I don't really think so. I was recruited by a friend of mine who I have a tremendous amount of respect for, incredibly intelligent when it comes to community moderation work and within journalism, Bossy Edom. And he had a really good sort of setup in place, a really good mindset that I could step into and just sort of contribute the value that I had to offer. And he was really good about empowering me to do that. So I didn't really have to, he wanted me for the way that I was already thinking, which I think was really nice and helped to get a lot done in a short period of time. So no, now of course I learned different things. I picked up different things working in it. Like CNN is a unique global beast in the litigious sense, in the size sense, in the reach sense. Like it's a unique place. Like when you work at CNN in media, even though I don't have a ton of media experience, I tend to think it's fairly unique. Like there aren't that many media orgs that have sort of the reach and the organizational setup. So there were things that I had to kind of fit in with. Certainly, I'm not I have to fit within a team and within a larger structure. But my thinking was a validation of sort of good, strong community ideals and thinking that I've sort of tried to build my career around.
Yeah. I love hearing your story because it leads right into one of the first lessons that you actually learned. And that is this: small community experience is relevant to big communities. And that's, in some ways, your journey. Talk a little bit more about what you mean there.
Sure. So I have a martial arts community that I've been running for 24 years in May. I was there before it launched, and I was there the whole 24 years as we turned 24, May 21st of this year. And they care about each other, and they have sort of this amazing rapport. And if someone comes into the community and is disruptive or disrespectful, they self-reject almost in a sense. It's not like we don't have moderation emergencies there. They just sort of get taken care of when they get taken care of, because the community culture is so strong. And so just over the last 24 years, that community, it's why I always tell people to launch a community. It's easier than ever. Just start something for something you like and build it end to end with no one supporting you, because it gives you this understanding of sort of product and community and managing a community and how it all works. Because when I'm at CNN coming up with policies that'll be deployed globally, or at least within the US at the start of CNN Plus. And I'm submitting those policies to legal. I'm writing policies that I wrote for my martial arts community. for the last 24 years. When I think about moderation challenges and how sort of things go through a certain workflow to get approved, I'm thinking through sort of the moderation processes that I designed in this small online community for martial artists. And so I think it's one of those things where people sometimes think that their community experience won't translate to large media brands or large mainstream brands at all. But the reality, I think, is that having that sort of grounding in independent online communities where you're responsible for everything actually serves you quite well. And we have so much more in common than we do dissimilar.
What does change when you start working at an enterprise level?
I mean, I think there are just sort of more levels of approvals and scrutiny and how things are looked at. And some of that can be scary. At CNN, we had something called the triad. And it's a public thing. You can Google it, CNN triad. But when you first get there, it sounds kind of scary. It's like, are you going to have to throw on like a gladiator costume? Do you have to get in the arena? Like, what's the triad? And it's sort of this very powerful group of three orgs within CNN: standards and practices, legal, and the row. The row are sort of the people who approve like your use of anonymous sources. They approve sort of death notices. Like they had a joke, something about like, CNN doesn't kill anyone. Like, we don't publish fake obituaries. Like, it has a process to go through. It doesn't matter how official it looks. You have to get the approval. And so those three orgs really decide sort of, do you get to report this story this way? Does your product exist? Do you get to survive doing this thing you want to do? And it could be a community and interactive product like we were building. Could be a streaming service. Could be news gathering. And so that seems very scary to people. But so I sort of had to, I wouldn't even call it changing, but just sort of understanding the system, kind of thinking about how it works, and then where my strengths lie and what I can offer them. End of the day, I was friendly with all those people, and I think they liked me because my philosophy in small online communities, big online communities, is to write things down and document them. And so once I kind of demonstrated that, they pretty much were like, you're good to go. The policies I wrote were approved with no notes. In one case. And, these are policies that are tied to the removal of content that CNN might face scrutiny for. But in some ways it was a validation. So it wasn't so much a change, but it's this type of, the only changes I really had to make were the type of changes you make when you take a new job and you sort of understand how their cadence goes as far as meetings, sprints, how they develop a product, who you need to talk to, who's kind of the decision maker on this thing, sort of understanding where those lines went. But, I think that good sound community philosophies and policies and procedures sort of translated really well at CNN.
Yeah. This leads right into your second lesson, because I know that when I talk to community managers, one of the things I hear a lot about is the need to get buy-in from different stakeholders within the organization. And I do imagine when you start getting into an organization as large as CNN, there are more stakeholders than ever. Here's what you said: securing buy-in might be scarier than it seems, which is an interesting way to phrase it. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, I just go back to the story I just mentioned about the triad. Like, these are all senior VPs at CNN. They've been there for 15, 20, 25 years. They're just very influential people at the company. And, my experience is they've held their jobs for so long because they're very good at their jobs. But to a new person coming in, like, CNN has a lot of people who have been there for a very long time. It can be very intimidating to sort of read through sort of how the org works, what the triad is, what they can do, and who they are. And so to me, that was sort of, I would say, among the initially scary things to look at and try to get buy-in for. But like I said, I went into those meetings with documentation, with the ability to explain what I was working on, to talk about my experience and how it would help this thing work well. And really what I found was that they wanted us to be successful. That was sort of their sort of MO, is like, we want you to be successful. Here's the way that we can do that legally for CNN, in line with CNN's standards and practices. Here's how we can do that. And, the concept that we brought to market was the concept that we envisioned for the most part. And I didn't really, even though it was scary initially, I think, coming into it with an open mind, coming into it with all the information made it a lot easier to go. So that's really what I mean. I mean, it seems scary, but it really wasn't that bad. Like, my time working with those folks was easier than my time working with, I don't know, other random people that controlled far less in the org. And I think that's probably why they stay in their jobs for so long, because they do want you to be successful, and they just want to find a way to get the necessary T's crossed and I's dotted so that CNN can kind of cover all bases.
I will say, as somebody who not only works with, but comes from organizations where we are used to creating content and building audiences, which is quite different than building spaces and allowing people to connect in them. When you control the content and you push it out, you've got a lot of control, and you can kind of keep control of it until it goes out the door. And, you know, community is not necessarily the same way, because you're kind of letting people come in and you don't know what's going to happen. It's a mindset shift. And so I have found myself working with media organizations and content creators, sort of having to reiterate the message and the mindset shift a lot. Was that your experience as well? Did you find yourself
You know what was
saying
really
things?
helpful was the attorney that we had on our product was very good, and especially was very experienced with UGC and user-generated content. So that helped a lot, because I came into the meeting thinking, do I have to explain Section 230? Which is a law in the U.S. that basically empowers companies, organizations, teenagers to moderate content without being liable for what they leave in place. So it empowers moderation versus sort of being overprotected and removing anything that could offend anyone, any billionaire at any time. You actually allow people to have conversations. And so I came into that meeting thinking, do I have to explain this? And I didn't. He kind of knew it. He was already experienced with it. He'd been around the block. So he was like, yeah, that's all fine. Your policies look good. You know what you're doing, and we're good to go. Just let me know if you need anything. Over communicate. So yeah, that helps. But if you don't have that, if you don't have someone who ultimately you need their approval, especially on the legal side of things, who is not well versed in UGC, online communities, any place where people can talk to one another without you necessarily being involved directly in the conversation. I mean, it can be challenging, and sometimes it requires some explanation. And our political and legal climate for online communities right now in the US is, I would say, at its weakest point in many years. Section 230 is still on the books, and it still does empower you to do that moderation work, but it has people who dislike it on both sides of the aisle, which is disappointing. And so, for right now, it's still the law of the land, and we can still moderate content in a way that is, I would say, that fits in line with the kind of communities we're trying to build in the U.S.
Yeah. In your experience, where do the biggest hurdles come from? Do they come from legal issues? Do they come from technical issues? Do they come from moderation, or just sort of the human side of getting people to behave a certain way? What were the biggest
I
challenges?
mean, I think that, so I'll tackle it in two things. So as a professional trying to get things done, the biggest challenge is people getting in my way. It's like and I don't mean that like no one, obviously I need to be managed, and I'm someone that you can check, and I'm happy to talk through and defend things that we make and the decisions that I make. But like ultimately, for example, I had a boss, it wasn't at CNN, it was somewhere else. And they had sort of a way of doing things that they did this way. And part of that was a process I don't really like, which is tagging 1 million people in the first reply. So there would be a business community. They would post, a business owner would post a question, and then they would come in and tag, it was a Facebook group, like 30 people, right? And there wasn't any thought about that, like who we're tagging, why we're tagging them, how do we do that? And to me, I don't like that process. I could talk about why. But more importantly, they hired me to sort of make things different or make things better. So I sort of refined that process, and I said, okay, so we want to invite people to conversations. I like that idea. We do not need to do it in a public tag. We also need to think about who we're inviting. So we should have a process for identifying people who can actually respond to this conversation and have the expertise needed to help the business owner who's asking the question. And so we did those things, and I think it got better. And I think it was an improved process that everyone benefited from. But the person who hired me, who couldn't keep his hands out of the community, would look at those threads and say, oh, there wasn't a public reply fast enough, so I did it myself. And he's just stepping all over what I'm trying to accomplish here, which is a more thoughtful way to bring people into conversations, and also not an advertisement on every single post that we need to tag 30 rando people in every conversation to make it feel like something is happening. Like, we don't need to do that, my opinion. And so he was just meddling in my work, and ultimately was sort of hamstringing my efforts and making them a little less successful. Like, we had great numbers, but they could have been better, and they could have been better if he leaned out, which is what he said he wanted to do when he hired me. So he didn't. So that's sort of, I think that, to me, more than legal, is sort of the type of thing when your boss or someone who has power in the org can't like lean back and actually let you manage and do the job. That's no fun for me, and it makes the job not fun, and that makes me want to leave.
Yeah, I understand. You said several things there that pick up on threads that we've heard from other people that we've talked to. We had a community consultant named Bree Lever, and one of the things she pointed out is that sometimes jumping in and replying isn't the right thing to do because you want the community members to interact with each other. And if you start to set the precedent that you're always going to be the one interacting, sometimes it discourages that. The other thing that you said that we have heard before is that it's really not about necessarily getting the most people in the room. It's about getting the right people in the room. And it sounds like you were very much aiming to try and get the right people into the spaces in what you were doing. So I hear a lot of things that you're saying that echo what we've heard in other places. Let's get to your third lesson that you've learned, which is protect the intent of the spaces. And before we talk about the intent of the spaces, you've touched on this a little bit, but describe in more detail what the spaces were actually going to be at CNN, where people could come in and collaborate. Were those things that you were using, were you building them for the ground up, or were you using platforms that already existed? Talk a little bit more about those spaces.
So we were building the spaces from scratch, and that was sort of part of my role on the product side of kind of helping to identify the product, design the product. There we had designers, but participating in the feedback loop for design and working with engineers and sort of coming up with this live Q&A platform where people could submit questions. They would go through an approval process my team owned, and then they would go up for voting. They could then be sorted by votes, and then ideally the most popular questions would be asked by the CNN personality to a celebrity. My favorite example is Dr. Sanjay Gupta asking questions to Dr. Anthony Fauci. Dr. Fauci was great, repeated community members' names when he answered their questions. It was really a great thing. And so but when I talk about intent with the space, it's almost more of a goal thing. Meaning so for Interview Club, the goal wasn't to create a primetime show that looked like what was on CNN at 8 p.m. The goal was to incentivize people to interact with a streaming service and to tune in live to see if their question was asked, or to ask a question that gets answered live, 3 minutes after they submit it, because that was part of the thing that we did. We staffed the shows with members of my team who would moderate the question queue live as it was going on, approve it, apply our standards to it, it would go up, and then theoretically a content team member would select it as a live question. So we're trying to incentivize interaction, not just questions submitting and asking, but also upvoting questions. That's your question once you upvote it. You're part of the process of getting it recognized. So we were trying to do something different. And to me, if it looked like a primetime show on CNN, that was a failure. That was not what we were trying to build. It wasn't supposed to be, for example, like Don Lemon having a conversation with some guest that Don Lemon wants to have. And as engaging as Don Lemon is, that wasn't the goal, right? He had a show at CNN. And so what we wanted to do was more of a community-centered thing where the CNN presenter was a conduit for the community to ask questions to the person. Now, what happened was some members of the content team really wanted to program it more like a primetime show. Like they wanted to have to have more of a script. They wanted to have more of the questions lined up far in advance. They wanted to know where it was going. And that kind of went against the intent of the program. What made it interesting, what made it engaging, was there some spontaneity to it. It's community powered. You don't always know exactly where it's going to go. And so, they would do things like wanting to seed questions. And I would be like, we shouldn't be submitting any questions. Even if we disclose it, which we should, that it came from CNN, that's not the idea of what we're doing here. We shouldn't be doing that. I don't want to do that. Unless we absolutely have to because we have no questions and the interview is going on, then sure, let the host ask questions from the host, like a normal show on CNN. Great. But we don't need to put questions from us in there for people to talk about. And so just things like that, that's a mindset on that side of things, was like, how can we make this show the same as what we're already doing, fit into our existing processes, and that kind of went against the intent. And so I actively sort of protected against that and was like, okay, we can get you questions, but like a half hour before the show. Like, how close can we get it to time where you actually lock it in? Like, we'll guarantee all questions are approved in the moderation queue by this time. What's the SLA, service level agreement? What's the time that we're going to do it in? I'll come up with a standard. Other than that, leave my moderators alone. don't bother them because they have a queue to watch. They're working. They're not going to get you early things. They're also not doing their job, which was part of the problem. It's like, have you checked the queue? Of course they're checking the queue. Assume good faith. Assume that we're doing our job over here, you know? But they were like, go, 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 go. I mean, I was glad I was on the tech side of things, the product side, and not the content side, kind of more the journalism side, because I remember having a conversation with someone on that side that was like, Christmas Day, I'm going to give, we're off. This isn't a news critical thing. Like when you join CNN, you sign a document that says you're available 24/7. You also sign a one sentence document that says you will agree not to falsify the news, which was one of the funniest documents I've ever signed in my life. But they were like, I can't guarantee Christmas Day. I was like, okay, well, my product tech people were like, of course we're going to take Christmas Day off. So I told my team, I was like, I'll work Christmas Day. If it comes down to it. We're not gonna, but I'll work it if it comes down to it. So they just had a different sort of intense, controlled manner of doing things that did not jive well always with the more unstructured, to your point about being different, being a little less, giving up some control, unstructured way that community can sometimes unfold.
And I'm hearing you bang on the table a little bit, so just be...
Sorry about that. Yeah.
That's all right. Let me... I'm so glad to hear you put it that way, because this was actually one of the things that I had sort of the hardest time wrapping my head around when it first came to community building, especially coming from a media and a content creation background. I'll never forget, I had a good friend who is still a disc jockey in Las Vegas, and he was streaming on Twitch. And I could never understand why people would spend time watching Twitch, watching people just play video games or react to stuff that was happening on the screen, when you could go watch Lord of the Rings or a Marvel movie or something that was sort of this big budget, high production value thing. And then one day he tells me he had a Howard Stern type whack pack of characters, and there was one that just annoyed everybody. And he said, we have this thing on my Twitch show where if people pay $20, we'll mute that guy for 5 minutes. And he said, I have shows where that guy's just muted for 3 hours and doesn't get to say anything. And what I finally realized is that the value from the audience point of view was not just the high production value of what's on screen, but it was that their actions were impacting what happened on screen, and they could take an action and they could see the product in real time be shaped by that. And the closest analogy I can think of is when I was in high school, I loved Lord of the Rings. Big piece of literature. Dude wrote histories and songs and languages. And then I love choose your own adventure books, which are nowhere on the level of literature that Lord of the Rings are. But I liked them for a different reason, that I influenced what happened to the story. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about here, where, the regular, nighttime show on CNN is it's the Lord of the Rings. But what happens in the community is people can take an action and see the impact that has on the space and on the product, and that's part of the attraction, right? I mean, that's what people enjoy about this.
Yeah, you can still watch the same show at prime time. We just need to make one more.
Right. No, that makes so much sense, but it is a hard thing to wrap your head around if that's not the universe that you come from. So I understand why you had to step in and protect that intent, and why, it took them a while to get it. All right, let's get into the fourth lesson that you learned, which is this. Good ideas sometimes disappear into canceled products. And this sounds like it hits close to home. Let's, tell me what you mean by this.
So, I mean, CNN Plus was a really interesting product to be a part of. And when CNN, to tell the story of CNN closing real quick, CNN Plus closing is on April 20th, 2022 at 9:33 p.m. at Cedars-Sinai Hospital over in Beverly Grove in LA. My wife gave birth to our first child, Patrick James. And less than 12 hours after that, by 9 a.m. the next morning, my phone started to go off in the recovery room. And I picked it up, and they had just announced that CNN Plus was closing on the first day of my parental leave. And so I was, in that day in the bathroom in the recovery room, I started talking talking to my team, who was all set and ready to rock for my 8 weeks of parental leave. Or was I taking 6 or 8? I forget. And, it was a surprise. And CNN Plus quickly became, and rightfully became, sort of a joke. Or a joke because of how quickly it started and failed. It became a joke with late night hosts, online, etc. And that's justified. Like, the way that it quickly started and ended is a joke. It's silly. It's sort of but it was a victim of a classic media merger, where Warner Brothers or Discovery didn't like the idea and didn't want to invest in it further. And so they had no skin in the game. So to them, when they came in, they just killed it, regardless of what had been invested into it already. And so, one of the tragedies of CNN Plus is whatever you might think of the idea, we actually don't know if it would have succeeded or failed. Maybe it fails, sure. We had, according to reporting, 150,000 plus paying subscribers in the first 2 or 3 weeks, which was ahead of projections and very good. Could it have played out well? We'll never know. But the thing about the ideas that were within CNN Plus is they weren't necessarily bad ideas because the product ultimately shut down or failed or was canceled. Like Interview Club, for example. That's a very simple concept, like we discussed, not revolutionary, but it doesn't mean that it was a bad idea for CNN, or it doesn't matter that or it doesn't mean that it couldn't have worked. And so I think that happens all the time. Like, we see things come and go, and we tend to think of things as failing as a whole or succeeding as a whole, but it's just like life's not that simple. Nothing is that simple. And so things don't always end because they were wholly bad. And it doesn't mean that you can't save ideas from things that are ending and move them into something else, or that the whole thing needs to go away because the overarching product or the brand is dying or going away. So yeah, I think there's just a lot of things that you can learn always from successful products and also from ones who are ultimately unsuccessful.
Yeah. So you think you'll be using a lot of concepts and things that you learned at CNN in some future project down the road, potentially?
Sure. The concepts I use at CNN are the same concepts I've been iterating on for a long time. So ultimately, we were building something that had some good sound community principles behind it, and we wanted to build more things, more products that brought people together on CNN. From the very simple, I used to half joke, half serious, say that I wanted to bring comments back to CNNplus.com, but only for CNN Plus subscribers, that it was only a benefit for those people who joined the streaming service. They could do more there. And so ultimately, that live Q&A thing is something that I think most journalistic outlets have attempted in some form or another. Maybe not as a routine schedule, maybe not 3 times a day, 5 days a week like we were focusing on. But that's a good idea for the right orgs to bring their community together, to involve them in the question asking, question forming process. It's very simple. You can go so much deeper than that. But I just think the idea that, I understand, on YouTube, you get a certain thumbnail style that hits, where it's like, this is a failure. And it's like, in every failure, there were probably some good ideas. There's a handful that weren't. But overall, most failures have a nugget or two that you can really learn from and take and run with.
Yeah. I know you can't speak for CNN today, but do you get the sense that even though CNN Plus is no longer a thing, that the idea of community is still bubbling up either there or in other news organizations?
Yeah, 100%. And it's sort of, yes, because CNN is, kind of the fifth point that we're going to talk about sort of ties in well to that, which is that, CNN has tried to, has done community things many times. CNN will do more of these types of projects. CNN has done these types of projects before, but where CNN suffers is that they have had a tough time committing to the long-term execution of these ideas, where they actually give them the time to succeed or fail on their own. 2 weeks is not enough time to determine if a $300-400 million investment, most of which is sunk cost, is a success. Not when you have 150,000 paying subscribers from the jump. That's just not enough time. That wasn't their goal. They weren't trying to see if it would be successful. But if you talk to long-timers at CNN, one of the things that becomes clear is kind of a joke, which is that CNN will just cancel an idea and then try to restart the same idea a week later. Like when I was leaving, I was invited to stay when CNN Plus was canceled, and I and a bunch of other people chose to leave. And in doing so, they tore up sort of this great community team. We had hired people. We had, Bossy is amazing. I'm there doing whatever I can do, good or bad. And then, it was like I heard there were meetings going on while I was still there, but heading out out the door about how CNN needs to tap into community ideas and concepts and products to hit the next level of success. And it's real hard. A media example that's very relevant to this idea of long-term execution and having success without long-term execution. The gold standard idea is the New York Times, because in every media org, in every newsroom, in every company, you hear this idea of the New York Times and their D2C revenue and their subscriber revenue, that they have this direct relationship. And it's so amazing. And everyone wants it. They said it at CNN. One of the models is to follow that model. The thing about the New York Times, it's not this simple, but they've had online comments for 25 years open. They never took away the ability to interact on NewYorkTimes.com, right? They choose a certain number of articles, they open them up, people can participate. They know the people who participate in the comments are worth more than the average New York Times customer. They pay more, they stay subscribed longer, they have a higher lifetime value. And so they know that that is a strong wheelhouse of people who pay the New York Times to stay subscribed. And they never did what so many media orgs did, which was to shut off everything and send it to Facebook to be unmoderated. And so, yeah, you need buy-in. You need a year or two. Like, community products need time. And if you're not willing to do a year or two on a community product that brings people together on your website or your domain, then you should not do it. You should do something else with the time. Start a newsletter, build a list of people you can contact that care about what you're doing. Just do something else.
Yeah. Well, that leads right into your fifth and final lesson, which is this. It's hard to have success without long-term execution. And we had the author Carrie Melissa Jones on one of our discussions, and I remember her saying it takes at least 18 months for a community to come together. And I suspect that that's if you really know what you're doing and everything is working properly. Yeah, talk about that. I mean, set some realistic expectations here for broadcasters. How long is it going to take to get community efforts up and off the ground?
Well, like I said, a year or two. I think a year or two is safe. I think 6 months at minimum. But realistically, if you're going to invest the time to choose a platform, to build a platform, to grow something that people are going to talk to one another on and spend time on, you kind of have to give it some time. And maybe that means that you kind of keep the investment in check, sort of recognize what you're spending, and sort of have a runway to grow over that 6 months to 24 months, if you can swing it, before you really start to make judgments about how successful this is, whether or not you should kill it, what you should do with it, etc. I think it's tough to do that, but that's what it takes to build really strong, enduring community products, is that time investment. And if you can't do it, that's okay. I understand. But it's you never want to start something and invite people, unless it's temporary in its very nature, like you're doing an event or you're doing some sort of singular event. You never want to start something and invite people to your space and then kill it in 3 months. Like, it's just, there's no point. It does more harm than it does any potential gain. So I think you wait until you're ready to actually invest in something and you can measure it, so you can see who the people are who are participating in those spaces and what they mean to your organization, or what they're giving you, how they're spending money, how often they renew and retain. And then you can determine if it's really worth it.
Yeah. You mentioned measurement. Are there some early signs you can see that will tell you whether you're on the right path, or, are there red flags that you might see early on that tell you that you need to do some course correction?
I think, I always look at 2 buckets of metrics. One are community health metrics. That's what I care about as a community builder, things that I want to see. And then the second bucket is business metrics, tying the community health to revenue. And that's how you can get further buy-in, investment, keep your job, keep things growing in a certain way. So the goal is to tie the two together. So community health would be something like active members is a very basic one. So you have your number of people who are actually active in the community and active at certain levels, maybe beyond visiting, posting, replying, things of that nature. And then, I think active members is a good one to kind of focus on, with the understanding that there's an ebb and flow to it. Like, things are not always up in communities. Things do go down. On this conversation I've had with multiple bosses is like, this is not a never-ending mountain. I'm not building a unicorn here. I am building a community, and those ebb and flow, and they ebb and flow at different times of year and around holidays and all sorts of things. And then once you find like 1 or 2, again, active members is a good one to sort of focus on at the start, tying that to sort of how people support whatever you're doing. So if you're a nonprofit, you're looking at sort of donations and sort of fundraising. If you're a subscription service, you're looking at sort of retention revenue. As an example, at one product that was a business community product where people paid to subscribe, we found that year over year, people who were active in the community, the online forum we had, beyond an introduction, meaning they talked in the community beyond saying hello, were 18.46% more likely to retain than someone who didn't. And that meant about $1.8 million in additional revenue for that organization. In retention revenue, the 18.46% gain in renewals was $1.8 million. And so, that's an example, but you need to find something that works with the people who you have to convince, and the people who will continue to support and invest in the thing you're doing. So you got to not only build these metrics out, but you got to talk to the people who you want them to influence and make sure that they're actually convinced and they believe in those metrics too. That's the fun of the work.
Wow. So, all right. What advice have you got for public broadcasters who may be, I think a lot of them are at the very beginning of their community building journey. They're just really starting to think about it. Where would you tell them to begin?
I always tell people to talk to the people who are using their thing right now. So your listeners, subscribers, readers, whatever it might be. I think you have to talk to people before you decide to take an initiative. So in other words, I would find the people who are most interested in what you're doing and either ask them a question that leads to a goal, meaning like you're trying to build a service like this, would they use it? Or if you have a specific idea in mind, ask them about that idea specifically. This doesn't have to be like a 200-person survey software powered email marketing campaign. It can be 10 people, 10 email addresses that you send manually and say, hey, we know you're a subscriber. Thank you for your loyalty. We're thinking about doing this. Would you use it? Would you help us get it started? And I think that'll help you kind of refine or ideate around some idea. Again, a simple example, if you're doing conversations in some form where people talk with one another, I think ideally what you want to have is not only people saying that they would like to do it, but that they'll help you start it so that you can start privately behind the scenes, let them in, have sort of some activity going with real people, not phony activity, and then you can invite the wider group of supporters in later. But yeah, start with 5 to 10 emails. Find 5 to 10 people you think would give you some honest feedback. Share with them what you're thinking. Listen to what they say. Change based upon that. Ask again. It's not 10 questions. It's like 2 or 3. So that's a good kind of starting point.
And that brings us full circle. Start with that small community experience, and then you can grow it from there. Patrick, the last question that I ask everybody is this. I want you to recommend a resource for people who are interested in community building. And this can be a podcast you listen to. It can be a book that you've read or a blog you follow or somebody that you follow on social media. What is a community building resource that you would recommend?
Who would I recommend? What would I recommend? I would recommend... I like Marjorie Anderson on LinkedIn. I would follow her. I don't think she's blogging anymore, but you can find her, Marjorie Anderson. She posts on LinkedIn. I like her a lot. And if you're looking for a newsletter, I'll throw in a bonus one. There's one called Everything in Moderation that covers sort of content moderation and the legal side of online community building, which is maybe a little heady for the listeners you said are tuning in. But still, it's an important topic, and knowledge helps to deal with fear that one has. You kind of express sort of the fear of losing control, but knowledge around sort of what the law allows and what's happening in the world, I think is a solve for that fear.
All right. Patrick, thank you so much for coming on and sharing all of your insights and your wisdom and your experience with us. This has been absolutely fantastic. I really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I'm Seth Ressler. This has been Beyond the Broadcast. Thank you so much for listening. You are invited to our virtual events anytime if you are a public media broadcaster. And of course, we'll always have the conversations here as well.